5511770. 0055
In this open learning series on marketing, we've explored the processes involved in identifying consumer needs and understanding consumer behaviour. We've also looked at the creation and application of appropriate marketing strategies and examined the central issues that concern all marketers, the 4 Ps. That's product, price, promotion and place. In this final program, we'll review and extend those issues in the context of our developing market environment. I'm speaking with Professor Peter Chandler, Dean of the David Syme Faculty of Business at Monash University in Melbourne. And we began by discussing how he thought marketing was changing.
Well, marketing is a bit of a moving feast. I suppose if you look back over the last 30 years or so, there has been a fairly accepted view about what one needs to do in order to apply marketing, in order to outperform others in the marketplace. And that is to analyse your market and apply the marketing mix to a segment of that market. And really that's how many firms have competed. What's happening now, though, is that the level of expertise available in marketing is rising across the community. The effect of that is that organisations are all doing the same thing, all getting the same sorts of answers from their marketing analysis, and that brings it back to somewhat of a zero-sum game. In some circumstances, they gain that competitive advantage by some creativity. It might be, for example, by being more creative in an advertisement than their competitors. But their competitors might well still be targeting the same market segment and trying to convey the same message, but the creativity gives the edge to one of those organisations. But in fact, what we're now seeing is that the areas within which firms compete are starting to move out from the narrow definition of marketing as we've tended to see it in the past.
Do you want to expand on that definition of marketing, just to remind us exactly what it is?
Yes, well, the conventional approach towards marketing is to analyse a market and to identify the needs in that market or groups or segments in that market that have some form of different requirement, whether it be in the actual product itself or the message that's conveyed to them or where they purchase it, or people with different lifestyles that will have different perceptions as to what is applicable and appropriate to them. Then having identified that basis for segmentation, then to develop a marketing mix of the controllable variables available to the marketer to target in on that market segment. Just as an aside, it's interesting to see the sorts of problems that occur from a research point of view in trying to identify that market segment. There are many firms spend a lot of money in research seeking to find these insights that are going to give them the edge. There's one chocolate manufacturer, for example, that found that there is a correlation between heavy chocolate consumption and church going. But that's not much value unless you're going to put a vending machine in the vestibule of the church. So quite often these insights don't lead you anywhere in terms of the implications for a marketing strategy. On other occasions they do.
What are some of the areas of emerging competitive advantage now?
Well, I think this is very exciting because in many ways we now have a body of knowledge relating to marketing, which I think there is a good understanding of in the community. But because, in fact, it no longer is the path to gaining an advantage on competitors, there is this continual search to find that new basis of getting a breakthrough in regard to, in the context of other organisations. And there are a whole host of things that fall into this category. The use of flexible manufacturing, or approaches towards gaining superior customer service, or the opportunity to provide superior quality, or the application of just-in-time techniques, or the use of information technology as a basis for gaining competitive advantage. There are just many different areas that firms are now finding as a way of getting a break on their competitors.
Let's look at some of these things in a little more detail,
Yes.
if we can, Peter. The customer focus.
Yes, well, this is one that in many ways is a direct extension of marketing practice as we've known it in the past. When firms applied the marketing concepts in the past, their real difficulty was finding the way to get other parts of the organisation outside of the marketing functional area to get involved in the business and to get involved in being sensitive to the needs of customers and responding to customers. Well, what's happening, really it's developed out of the service industry in North America, where in fact they're very dependent on the people behind the scenes, if you like, in the organisation, helping to provide the systems and the service that ultimately the customer receives. They've found a way of actually changing the culture of organisations to bring about a responsiveness on the part of the whole organisation. Now, whilst I don't have time to go into this full theory of how it's being done, really the starting point in the whole process is to identify what the values are that you need to supply to your customers, because quite often we don't know what they are. They're often hidden because sometimes there are things that might seem minor to an organisation, which indeed are major from the point of view of the consumer. Take, for example, a bank. Having a pen that works when you go into the branch of a bank is a very important value that a customer expects from you. And seeing we've picked up the example of banks, it's interesting to see how the banks started this process. They thought smiling was important. You might remember a few years ago, they had all the tellers wearing T-shirts with big smiles on them, and they were encouraging their staff to smile to customers. Well, as they became a little more sophisticated, they came to realise that smiling wasn't an important issue. What really was important were a range of other values that they had to be good at delivering. So the first thing they did was to identify those things. Then, having identified them, what they did was they started measuring them so that people knew how the performance of the organisation was occurring in that regard. If I could just use an example of that, Dulux is a company in Australia that's been very good at focusing on providing superior customer service. And this is a brochure that they produced for their own staff a few years ago, just to show you the changes that have occurred there. In February 1988, the probability of a customer contacting a Dulux site, that's a retail outlet selling Dulux products, by telephone to place an order, and for the customer to have the phone answered within 4 rings, the order being delivered in full, on time, correctly priced, and accurately invoiced, the probability of all those things happening was 23%.
Very low.
Very
and that's
low.
In 1988.
That's right.
Yeah.
What's worse, of course, was the probability they discovered of completing that process correctly 5 times in a row was 0.05%. So here was a situation where, in fact, these were factors that were very important to their customers, And when they started measuring it, they discovered that they were providing, in effect, a bad performance in that area. Now, in subsequent years, as a result of change in the culture of Dulux, they've brought that up to the 80 to 90%. I think it's in the 90s now. So they are competing in an area now which is very important to their customers, and they're a superior provider in that area.
Let's talk about information technology now,
Yes.
because obviously that must be a very valuable tool today for a marketer.
Yes, well, in fact, in many cases, it's changed the rules upon which competition occurs. If you think, for example, of the brand name Benetton, how was it that Benetton became so successful in Europe? The answer is that, in fact, Benetton were able to reduce the lead time between the actual production of the garments that were supplied and the retailing of those garments, whereas that used to take 6 or 9 months from the time you placed the order until the product came into the store. Benetton made these garments into a semi-processed form, and then each night in Benetton retail outlets, they would use electronic communication to communicate back to the factory what had been sold in the store that day. And that would then be immediately replaced by the factory. Well, you can see that the implications of that is that you avoid stockouts and you avoid oversupply, which means that those products have to be discounted at the end of the season. So in fact, that's an example of how they were able to outperform their competitors using a linkage between what the market wanted and what they were actually producing.
Obviously they were delivering just in time or before time, in fact.
Yes, well, there are many other examples of that. The one that is most commonly quoted is the American Airlines story of how they were able to put computer terminals into travel agent offices so that the travel agent could book travel on the spot, not just air travel, but all the other bookings as well. And because they beat competitors in providing this facility, American Airlines ended up in an extremely strong position. And it's so much so that the chairman of American Airlines was quoted that if he had to sell anything, he'd sell the airline before this computer booking system. In other words, he'd created a new market which had given a major competitive advantage to American Airlines. So I think
and
the message...
his competitors were copying that.
Well, it was very difficult to be second person in, and that's the thing that's often so worrying in this area. In the case of the American Airlines, once that booking system was in with the travel agent where they could book anything, why did they need another alternative system in the travel agent? So this example shows how technology can provide a quantum leap on one's competitors and eventually potentially block your competitors out of that market. Just one other example, if I may, Hospital Products in America, which is a firm that actually put terminals in the supply offices in hospitals so that you could actually order online from the hospital purchasing office for your needs. Well, again, once they had provided that facility for the buyers, it became very difficult for anybody else to get into that market.
Flexible manufacturing, that must be important, and that's something that Australia has often been seen as lagging behind.
Yes,
and quality, if you want to talk about those two together.
Well, that and all those, you could add a third there, just in time, that all those three areas are becoming very important. You might say, well, what's this got to do with marketing? But clearly, taking quality for a start, providing superior quality is an important basis of gaining a competitive advantage. It's a way of differentiating your product from others. So you might say, well, the product quality, that's the problem of the factory, but it's very much a marketing issue as well, if in fact it's a basis upon which people would prefer to deal with your firm rather than somebody else's. So quality as an issue has become important. Just in time is becoming important because not only does it provide flexibility, but it also enables an organisation to keep its costs low. It doesn't need to carry the same level of stocking. And the effect of that, of course, is that when it comes to setting the price, that element of the marketing mix, you've got an opportunity to be a low-cost producer, which potentially will give you advantage in the market. And then the third one I think you mentioned was flexible manufacturing.
Yes.
Well, that's an area where I think we're going to see much more effort in Australia. The Japanese have embarked on a campaign of dramatically reducing the amount of time that it takes to set the dies up for a production run. If you look at the Japanese marketing strategy historically, they've tended to go for long production runs of fairly standardised products. And in that, they've been able to get reduced costs and they've been able to invest in the research and development. But in fact, what the Japanese are on about now is being able to change the production line from producing product A to producing product B in 10 minutes. So the effect of that is that you get all sorts of flexibility in your capacity to target narrow market segments. I've got here, for example, something happening in Australia. Mitsubishi are reducing the amount of time, for example, that it involves them in installing a small press in a production line. 10 years ago, it took 46 minutes. Today, it takes 4 minutes. If you can keep your line operating with very short downtime between these changes, clearly there are great cost advantages and the opportunity for targeting many more segments than otherwise would be the case.
And of course, the Japanese are setting the trend in this, have done for years, I gather.
Yes, well, there's a lot to learn from the Japanese. We've discovered, for example, a lot about how they penetrate international markets. There's been quite a lot of research that's shown that often when they're trying to break into an international market, they'll go into a market that's relatively easy to get into initially, and they'll go with a fairly low-cost standardised product, and they'll get the economies of scale that way. And when they go into the more sophisticated markets, they'll go in at the El Cheapo end, where there's less competition. You know, people say, let's not bother with that segment of the market. There's no money in it. But they get their beachhead that way. And as they get the economies of scale of very large production, they're able to reinvest in research and development that help them work up towards these more sophisticated segments, such as the car industry right now.
Right. But how does someone keep up to date, you know, with these new bases of gaining a competitive advantage? They're changing all the time.
Absolutely. And I think that means that many professional marketers have to read quite widely to not just conventional texts, but some of the books that are exploring some of these new concepts. And I think perhaps more importantly, some of the articles that are exploring some of these ideas. I think one of the most valuable journals in this regard is the Harvard Business Review. Certainly for any student undertaking a marketing course, I think it would be very valuable for them to be regularly reading the Harvard Business Review, because often these concepts are explored, and typically they draw on examples from industry to show how companies are trying to apply them.
That would be an appropriate companion to these series of programs.
Yes, I think that's probably the sort of publication one would be looking to access via a library.
Let's look now at a problem, a marketing problem that a marketer might have and how they go about analysing it. For example, does one work out one's objectives first and foremost?
I think that's quite important. I mean, one of the nice things about marketing is that there is no right answer in a sense. There are a whole range of possible right answers. The answer as to the appropriate strategy really depends on the corporate objectives that you have in the first place. Some of the older viewers might recall a brand of television set that came onto the market when black and white television first came in. It was called Admiral. Now that was a brand where the objectives of that company were only to stay in Australia during the early stages of the development of television. They didn't intend to stay around for the tough times that occurred when everybody had television. Now, the effect of that, from a strategy point of view, was quite profound. Knowing what the company objectives were meant that the marketing strategy would respond accordingly.
What about problem definition? I mean, you have to define your problem before you can overcome it, presumably.
Yes, it's not as easy as it sounds either. I mean, if you put the hat on of a marketing consultant going into a firm to talk about their marketing problems, the first thing they'll probably tell you is what they perceive as their problem. But I think you've got to be very careful not to necessarily take that problem at face value. They might talk, for example, about sales declining. But is sales declining a problem or not? It's really a symptom of a problem. And so you've got to dig in a bit deeper. And certainly the way we encourage our students to look at this is we encourage them to try and define the problem as a marketing strategy problem in a way that they express it in a way that it's in terms of what is to be addressed. So it may well be, for example, the problem is to determine the appropriate marketing strategy in order to target a market with product X. So that way they know when they get to the end of the analysis whether indeed they've gone through this process and addressed the problem that they'd previously defined.
For example, buying patterns. That's an important setting.
It is indeed. Now, in fact, if you look at how most people tackle marketing problems, typically what happens is that they, having identified the problem, they go straight for a solution. And really we've discovered, and our teaching really encourages students to hold back from trying to find a solution. We encourage them to look at the problem in its setting in a very objective sense, to forget about their organisation, their company, and just look to see what's going on in that market. And they need to look, for example, at the market size, the market growth, what competitors are doing in that market, any trends in the market that might have some impact on them, and the very point that you touched on, what the buying patterns are, because it's really that analysis of buying patterns that will help you segment the market.
Yes, I mean, what you're suggesting is do a bit more research, don't go for the quick fix.
Well, yes, it's really, this part of an analysis is very clinical. I mean, I liken it to being up in a helicopter, looking down on the market, trying to understand how that market fits together, trying to get a handle on just what is motivating people. And if I may, just picking up again your point on buying patterns, quite often it's not as obvious as it seems. I mean, I mentioned Dulux before, and I think if you think about do-it-yourself paint, it's a good example. If we were trying to develop a strategy to develop the market for do-it-yourself paint, if we asked ourselves the question, well, who buys, or how they buy, or where they buy, why they buy, those types of questions, if we dig in there, we'll find in a normal household situation, surprisingly enough, it's the wife that is often a very important player in deciding what brand is going to be selected. And she plays that role because often she is the person that decides that something needs painting in the house. And she is the one that gets the colour card and selects the colour and then hands it across to her husband to go out and get the paint. Now, if the husband's very brave, he can go out and say, well, primrose pink, that's near enough to Presley purple, which my wife wanted, or more likely he will get exactly what the wife dictated. So the message there is that whilst the husband's actually buying the paint, it's the wife that is the very important decision maker. So you can see how buying patterns can be terribly important to the strategy that you ultimately develop.
And of course that strategy is a marketing mix, so you have to look at your existing marketing mix, presumably.
Well, in fact, you're quite right. Having looked at this market in a detached way, in terms of what's going on in the overall market, you need to come back and then see what you're currently doing, just in an objective sense. How are we positioning ourselves in the market in relation to competitors? Just how are we fitting into this overall market that we'd previously defined?
And then we go into locating or identifying alternative strategies.
Yes, this often comes out of some sort of what's sometimes called a SWOT analysis, looking at your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats through putting together what you're doing in your market against what the market is doing overall, putting those components together, you start to find ways that you can find a strategy. Keep in mind that we're looking at a full marketing strategy. What many people do in practice is they think that they're dealing with a pricing problem or a product problem, one element of the mix. But really what you're trying to do is to find out how you can position your overall organisation in relation to that market or market segment that you've defined earlier.
Then of course we must evaluate.
Absolutely.
Is that easy?
Well, there are two sides to it, you see. One is the quantitative side, and I suppose you could say that's the number crunching part of it, where people typically do break-even analysis or find some way of quantifying what the payoff is likely to be from this alternative vis-a-vis that alternative. But apart from the quantification of the payoff, there are all those qualitative issues as well that we need to take account of, which sometimes is difficult to put numbers on, that help us decide which of the strategies we should select.
So it's more than just intuition in the end?
Well, absolutely. It's a combination of numbers and weighting of those other non-quantitative factors.
Then the grand finale, we select the best alternative on the basis of that strategy that we've gone through.
Yes, that's what we're looking to. Really, picking up my earlier point, there's no right answer. The right answer or the right strategy is the one that ties back to whatever the overall corporate objectives were. But one can always know if you've got a strategy that makes sense, in a sense. There's a way of checking it. Firstly, the strategy should somehow or another tie back to the buying patterns that you identified earlier, and the strategy should be focused on a market segment, and the strategy should be spelling out what all of the elements of the marketing mix are going to do in relation to that market segment. So should be spelling out what's happening from a price point of view, from a promotion point of view, product and distribution, or place as it's sometimes called.
So a marketing strategy is a demanding and exacting business, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's this tricky balance between cold hard logic and analysis and data collection, and on the one side, and those creative insights on the other. And it really requires skills in both areas.
It is critical to that competitive edge for any business.
Yes, and of course, it's the competitive edge, and succeeding and gaining that competitive edge isn't achieved by being locked into a conventional step-by-step process of what we did last year and improving it this year. It's really standing back from that market and having a good understanding of how the competitive forces are changing that market. And that's why those emerging issues in competitive advantage are so important in many organisations, to be sensitised to how, in fact, one's competitor can perhaps move ahead of you by drawing in skills or techniques or approaches outside of the conventional marketing area as a way of improving the way they're interfacing.
That was the final episode of Marketing. Next Friday morning at 4 o'clock, we begin the Australian Environmental Studies series, The Unique Continent. Coming up, Out of Empire.
If you would like information about studying through open learning, phone 0055 11770. 0055 11770.